Join us on this 9 miles kayak on the Loughor Estuary from Loughor to Burry Port on the 13th of July 2024. Watch on to see what it's like paddling on one of the biggest estuaries in Wales. Learn about the Roman fort and Norman castle at Loughor. Find out about the tandem kayaks that we used on this trip. And learn about safety issues including sandbanks, tides and currents which affect this route. This 9 miles paddle from Loughor to Burry Port was along the Loughor Estuary, which separates the Gower Peninsula from Carmarthenshire in southwest Wales. We launched from Loughor at 12 noon and paddled past the bridges and the site of the Roman fort and Norman castle. After passing the Millennium Coastal Park and the rejuvenated former tin plating areas of Llanelli, we paddled down the estuary with the outgoing tide, landing at Burry Port at 3:30 p.m. It's 12 noon and we've just launched from below Loughor Boat Club, so we're paddling downstream towards the bridges. As usual, there were a number of anglers fishing from the banks either side of the bridges at Loughor. The tidal current apparently races quite fast through the narrow point in the estuary where the bridges are situated at Loughor. It's therefore advisable to paddle underneath the bridges fairly close to high tide when the water will be relatively slack. Looking upstream, you can see the Loughor Estuary winding its way inland towards Pontarddulais, which is way in the distance. The Roman fort at Loughor, also known as Loughor, was situated on the bluff on the east bank of the estuary, adjacent to where the road and rail bridge are. The fort was built around 75 AD and was strategically placed to guard the lowest crossing of the river Loughor. The site later became the location for Loughor Castle, built by the Normans around 1106. You can see the remains of the stone tower of the Norman castle on the mound in the footage. The Norman castle reused the remains of the Roman fort and played a significant role in the region's medieval history. We continued downstream of the Loughor bridges, the vast vista of the estuary providing an amazing backdrop to our trip. I'd previously done some great walks and bike rides along the track that runs along the north bank of the estuary, but paddling on the estuary itself is an experience several levels up again. Ahead of us in the distance, on the left or the south bank of the estuary, you can just about make out Llanmaddock Hill and Whitford Point on the Gower. Downstream from Loughor, the estuary widens out as shown in this drone footage from a later date, in which you can see some of the sandbanks which emerge when the water levels are lower. On this trip we were trying to stay on the right or north side of the estuary as much as we could, since we wanted to focus on the Llanelli side of the estuary. We had paddled the south or Gower side of the estuary the year before, going from Loughor down to Whitford Point and on to Broughton Bay on the Gower. The Loughor is one of the widest estuaries in Wales, and when the tide is in, you're on a body of water which is about 3 miles wide at its widest point. The terrain on the Llanelli and Gower sides of the estuaries are quite different to paddle past, with the Gower side being more rural and the Llanelli side more developed, but they are both equally captivating in their own ways. It looks like there could be a mid-estuary collision unless Mike and Archie steer hard to starboard. There's Mike and Archie with Penclawdd on the Gower side of the estuary in the background. The Loughor Estuary is obviously very tidal, so it's crucial to plan your trip around the tides. If paddling this route like us, downstream from Loughor to Burry Port, then we'd suggest that you launch from Loughor about half an hour or so before high tide, since the water will then be fairly slack when you paddle underneath the bridges at Loughor, and you'll also have the assistance of the outgoing tide as you paddle downstream along the estuary. If you're doing this route the other way from Burry Port up to Loughor with the incoming tide, then you should launch about 3 to 4 hours before high tide. It does depend how fast you paddle though. It took us about 3.5 hours to paddle the 9 miles route, but that included a lunch break of at least 30 minutes, plus we had the wind against us for most of the route. Alternatively, if you were fit enough, then you could do it as an 18-mile round trip from Burry Port up to Loughor and back. As you can see, we've grounded out on some sandbanks. It's just as well that Mike is about 6'6", so his legs should be plenty long enough to paddle in the water. We've obviously strayed too close to the northern side of the estuary and have managed to get stranded on this sandbank. Keep going, Ethan. It's only another 6 miles to walk the kayak to Burry Port. After being stranded on the sandbanks due to our navigational lapse, we waded out into the middle of the estuary until it was deep enough to launch our kayaks and start paddling again. The town of Llanelli sprawls along the northern side of the Loughor Estuary. Llanelli was industrialised in the early 19th century as the global centre for tinplate production. Lying near the western fringe of the South Wales coalfield, Llanelli played an important role in industry, with coal exported through 3 small docks along with the copper and tin produced within the town itself. The only surviving remnant of Llanelli's tinplating past is the Trostra Steelworks, which is a large tinplate manufacturing facility. The old docks still exist, but much of the former industrial areas of Llanelli bordering the estuary have been rejuvenated and now are used for leisure. It's a great area for walking, cycling and of course kayaking. When the tide is in, the Loughor Estuary looks like a wide lake, and in the middle it forms an expanse of water about 3 miles wide from North Gower across to Llanelli. However, as the tide drops, large expanses of sandbanks start to emerge, and it can therefore become troublesome trying to paddle the estuary within 2 hours or so either side of low tide. Our suggestion is therefore to only paddle the estuary within 3 to 4 hours either side of high tide, to ensure that there's enough water in the channels for you to paddle without grounding out on the sandbanks. On our kayaking guides playlist, we have a guide to estuary kayaking video. About halfway along the route we stopped off for a lunch break on some sandbanks which were gradually emerging as the tide went out. Our lunch and cider stops are arguably the highlight of our kayaking trips. I'm not sure we'd had a lunch stop on a sandbank before, but it's always good to broaden our horizons. On the subject of sandbanks, Archie and Mike were using a Sandbanks Style Optimal tandem inflatable kayak. The Sandbanks is a full drop stitch inflatable kayak which inflates up to 12 psi. As a result, the decks and hull are quite rigid and firm. The Sandbanks Optimal has a roomy cockpit and a slight V along the keel to help with tracking. We've done a full review of the Sandbanks Optimal tandem kayak on our product reviews playlist of our channel, which is linked below. The Sandbanks Style Optimal also comes in a shorter solo only version. Mike and Archie are still going strong. In the background you can see North Gower with Llanmaddock Hill and Whitford Point. The end is in sight. Ahead of us in the distance you can see Burry Port Harbour. Over there you can see Whitford Point and Whitford Lighthouse. We paddled past the lighthouse last year when we did the Gower side of the estuary. Regarding logistics, at Loughor we had parked up in the free parking bays which are on the road down to Loughor Boat Club and launched onto the estuary from the bank just below the parking bays. There is also a slipway at Loughor Boat Club slightly upstream, but we'd suggest that you ask the boat club for permission if you want to launch or land on the slipway. At Burry Port, we parked in the pay and display car park adjacent to the RNLI Coast Guard station. Bus X11 runs between Burry Port and Loughor if you only had one vehicle. Ethan and I were using an Itiwit X100 tandem inflatable kayak on this trip. We were using the 2 or 3 person model of the X100 kayak, but it also comes in a smaller 1 or 2 person model. The Itiwit X100 we used is a roomy and comfortable kayak with a high pressure drop stitch floor but lower pressure side tubes. We have done full reviews of both the 1 and 2 person model and the 2 and 3 person model of the X100 kayaks on the product reviews playlist of our channel. We approached the golden sands of Burry Port Beach as we neared the end of our Loughor Estuary trip. If the tide is still in enough, then you can possibly paddle into Burry Port Harbour and land on the slipway there to avoid the trek across the beach. However, by the time we got to Burry Port on our trip, it was over 3.5 hours after high tide, and the high tide was 6.91 metres, which is not that high for Burry Port. Since the tide had already dropped below the entrance to the harbour, we had to land on the beach and trek over 500 metres across the beach carrying our kayaks and gear. Before Burry Port Harbour was built in the 1830s, the town did not exist, as up until the early 19th century the population centre had been Pembrey. Burry Port Harbour provided a means to transport coal produced in the nearby Gwendryth Valley coalfields out to sea. We landed at Burry Port at 3:30 p.m, looking forward to a well-earned beer and some food at the Shipper Ground pub in Pembrey. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video then please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing by clicking on the left below. Click on the right below to see videos of our other trips around the Wales coast. Happy paddling from the kayak crew.